On the last night of the year, when London dressed itself in borrowed splendor, humiliation arrived without invitation. The chandeliers of Ashcombe House blazed like captive suns, their lights spilling over silk gowns, polished boots, and faces trained into expressions of effortless belonging. Music drifted through the ballroom, strings sighing, violins whispering promises they would not keep. And at the far edge of that brilliance stood Miss Eleanor Hartwell, perfectly still, as though movement itself might draw further attention to her disgrace. She had come alone. That, in itself, was not a crime, yet society treated it as one. Her gown was dove-gray, elegant in cut but plain beside the jeweled confection surrounding her. No mother hovered at her shoulder, no aunt whispered instructions behind a painted fan. Eleanor's gloves were mended with care, her shoes polished until they reflected the candlelight with quiet defiance. She stood tall, because she had learned long ago that shrinking only sharpened the cruelty of others. The whispers found her anyway. They say she was invited merely to fill a space. Poor creature, no prospects, no fortune. I heard her father left nothing but debts and apologies. Each murmur landed like a pin pressed delicately into flesh. Eleanor did not turn her head. She had perfected the art of appearing unaware, of gazing just beyond the insult as though her thoughts resided somewhere far more elevated than the ballroom of Ashcombe House. Yet her heart thudded with a rhythm entirely its own, loud enough, she feared, to betray her composure. She had not expected kindness, but she had hoped, foolishly, for indifference. Indifference would have allowed her to exist unnoticed, to observe the turning of the world without becoming its entertainment. Instead, she was mocked. A curiosity, a woman whose presence invited commentary, speculation, and a particular sort of pity that felt indistinguishable from contempt. When the hostess passed her without acknowledgement, offering her smile instead to a girl barely out of the schoolroom, something in Eleanor shifted. Not broke, she had been broken before, but hardened, like glass tempered by repeated heat. She inhaled slowly, tasting the mingled scents of beeswax, perfume, and winter air trapped within the high-ceilinged room. Tonight would end. All things did. It was then that the room altered, as though an unseen hand had stilled the air. The music faltered, only for a breath, yet every instinct sharpened. Heads turned. Conversations bent inward. Eleanor followed the collective gaze and saw him at last. The Duke of Ravensmere stood just inside the ballroom doors, his presence commanding without effort. He was dressed in severe black, relieved only by the crisp white of his cravat, as if color itself were a concession he refused to grant the world. His expression was composed, almost remote, yet his eyes, dark, observant, missed nothing. This was a man known for rules, for lines drawn and never crossed. A man whispered of with equal parts reverence and fear. Eleanor had never spoken to him. She had never expected to. As he moved forward, the crowd parted instinctively, like water yielding to stone. Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest, an awareness she could neither explain nor welcome. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like the Duke of Ravensmere did not see women like her. They passed over them as one passed over furnishings. Necessary, perhaps, but unremarkable. And yet, his gaze flickered, briefly, in her direction. It was not lingering, nor was it dismissive. It was assessing, as though he had stumbled upon a detail that did not align with the rest of the room. Eleanor's fingers curled slightly at her sides. She held his gaze for a heartbeat too long, then inclined her head in a gesture of formal acknowledgement, expecting nothing in return. He inclined his head back. The exchange lasted no more than a second. No one else seemed to notice. And still, Eleanor felt as though something irrevocable had occurred, a quiet disturbance beneath the polished surface of the evening. A laugh rose nearby, too loud, too sharp. Miss Hartwell, a woman's voice chimed sweetly. You must forgive us. We assumed you had already departed. The word struck with practiced precision. A dismissal cloaked as concern. Eleanor turned, meeting the speaker's smile with one of her own, calm and unembellished. I would not leave without offering my thanks, she replied. Her voice did not tremble. That victory, however small, was hers. She curtsied, perfect in form, then stepped away from the light, toward the corridor beyond the ballroom. Each step carried the weight of decision. She would leave now, while dignity remained intact. She would not wait for the night to finish dismantling her. Behind her, the music resumed. Ahead, the corridor lay in shadow. She did not see the Duke turn. She did not hear the sudden hush, nor the startled intake of breath that rippled through the room as he watched her go. Watched, and for the first time in years, questioned the rule he had sworn never to break. He had built his life upon restraint, upon vows made in the quiet aftermath of loss, and those vows had served him faithfully. They had kept the world orderly, predictable, safe. Yet as Miss Eleanor Hartwell disappeared into the dim passage beyond the ballroom, a fissure opened within that order. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it breathed. For the first time, Ravensmere felt the weight of a choice not yet spoken, a consequence not yet paid. The rule remained unbroken, intact as iron, but iron, too, could bend when heated long enough. He took one deliberate step forward, unseen by her, unheard by the crowd, and in that step lay the beginning of a scandal no one had yet named, and a promise he did not yet dare to make. Somewhere behind him, society smiled, unaware that its neat arrangements had already begun to unravel. The night held its breath, waiting for the moment dignity would demand defiance. And fate listened, patient, merciless, and very near tonight. Morning light revealed what candlelight had concealed: consequences. Eleanor Hartwell woke to the sound of carriage wheels on wet stone and the dull ache of having been seen when she had wished only to disappear. London did not forget its curiosities overnight. It polished them, sharpened them, and sent them back into the world with interest accrued. By noon, the whispers from Ashcombe House had ripened into certainty, and certainty into rumor, and rumor into judgment. She felt it in the way her landlady lingered at the doorway, in the pause that followed her name when spoken aloud, in the letters that did not arrive. Eleanor occupied her morning with careful order. She pressed her gown, mended a seam, and wrote 2 notes of thanks she doubted would be answered. The discipline steadied her hands. She reminded herself that she had survived worse than omission. Her father's debts had taught her the value of silence, and her mother's early death had taught her not to expect rescue. Still, as the hours passed, a strange anticipation tugged at her, unwelcome and persistent, like a memory she could not quite place. The knock came just past noon. It was precise, unhurried, as though whoever stood beyond the door assumed it would be answered. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before opening it. The footman wore Ravensmere livery, immaculate and unmistakable. He bowed, producing a small parcel wrapped in dark paper and sealed with wax. "With the Duke's compliments," he said, offering nothing further. No explanation, no instruction. Eleanor accepted the parcel as one might accept a blade, aware of its potential to wound. When the door closed, the silence pressed close. She broke the seal slowly. Inside lay a pair of gloves, kid leather so fine they seemed spun rather than stitched, the color a deep winter blue. Beneath them rested a card, unadorned, bearing only her name in a firm, elegant hand. No message accompanied the gift. No claim was made, and yet the meaning pulsed unmistakably beneath the restraint. Gloves were intimate things. They implied hands. They implied presence. Eleanor felt heat rise to her face, anger chasing wonder. What right had he to intrude upon her quiet, to place this question before her without words? She did not put the gloves on. She closed the parcel and set it aside, determined not to let curiosity master her. Yet the gloves lingered in her thoughts as she stepped out later that afternoon, walking the familiar streets with an awareness sharpened to discomfort. She sensed eyes upon her where before there had been none. At the milliner's, conversation faltered when she entered. At the bookseller's, a woman leaned close to another and murmured, "That is her." By evening, the rumors had acquired detail. The Duke of Ravensmere, it was said, had noticed Miss Hartwell. Some claimed he had escorted her from the ball. Others insisted he had defended her honor in sharp tones. The truth mattered little. What mattered was that her name now traveled in company far grander than she could control, and that such travel never occurred without cost. Eleanor returned home unsettled, her composure worn thin. She reached her door only to find another visitor waiting. Mrs. Calder, a distant relation by marriage, her expression tight with poorly disguised concern. "My day," she began without preamble. "I felt it my duty to warn you. Attention of this sort rarely ends well for women in your position." "And what position is that?" Eleanor asked quietly. Mrs. Calder hesitated. "Unprotected." The word struck deeper than intended. Eleanor inclined her head, thanked her for her care, and closed the door with finality. She leaned against it for a moment, breathing through the familiar ache of pride bruised but unbroken. She would not be schooled into retreat by fear dressed as kindness. The following day brought no relief. An invitation arrived, astonishing in its boldness, from Lady Ashcombe herself, requesting Eleanor's presence at a small music hall. The card was formal, impeccable, and unmistakably strategic. Declining would confirm guilt. Attending would invite spectacle. Eleanor sat with the invitation until twilight, then chose resolve. She would go. The music hall was a quieter affair, its intimacy more dangerous for that very reason. The room buzzed with expectation thinly veiled as civility. Eleanor felt it in every glance that lingered a fraction too long. Then the door opened, and the Duke of Ravensmere entered without announcement. He did not look at her at once. He greeted his hostess, exchanged a few words, and took his place near the pianoforte. Only then did his gaze find Eleanor, steady and unflinching. A murmur rippled through the room, subtle yet unmistakable. The Duke did not smile. He inclined his head to her, formally, and she returned the gesture, her pulse loud in her ears. When the music began, he crossed the room. He stopped before her, his presence a study in controlled power. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice low enough to belong only to them, "I trust you are well." "I am," she replied, meeting his eyes, "though I suspect that state is temporary." A corner of his mouth tightened, not quite a smile. "London is unkind to ambiguity." "And yet you create it," she said softly, glancing toward the watching room. "I do not," he answered. "I acknowledge it." The distinction was razor-thin. Before she could reply, Lady Ashcombe's gaze flicked toward them, sharp with curiosity. The Duke straightened, his expression once more unreadable. He offered Eleanor his arm. The gesture was small, devastating, and entirely deliberate. The room stilled. Eleanor hesitated only a heartbeat, then placed her gloved hand upon his sleeve, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet. Whatever this was, it had passed beyond rumor. It had become declaration. And as they stood together, framed by silence and scrutiny, Eleanor understood that the gift of gloves had not been a question at all. It had been a warning, and a promise, and an invitation into a scandal neither of them could now undo. Night settled over Ravensmere House like a held breath, the kind that pressed against the ribs and refused release. Eleanor was shown through corridors lined with portraits whose eyes followed without mercy, each ancestor a silent judge. The Duke's study lay at the far end, its door closed, light leaking beneath in a thin, deliberate line. When it opened, warmth and lamplight spilled out together, carrying the scent of leather, ink, and fire. He did not invite her to sit at once. That omission was intentional. She remained standing before the hearth while he closed the door and turned the key with a quiet finality that sent a wind skimming along her skin. The fire snapped softly, illuminating the severe planes of his face, the restraint etched into every line. Away from witnesses, he looked older, wearier, and unmistakably human. "You should not have come," he said. "And yet you sent for me," Eleanor replied. His gaze held hers, dark and unguarded. "I sent because London will not allow silence. It has already decided what you are to me." "And what am I?" she asked. The question lingered between them, fragile as glass. He moved at last, not toward her but to the desk, resting his hands upon its surface as though anchoring himself. "You are a complication I did not anticipate," he said. "I have built my life to avoid such things." Eleanor's spine straightened. "Then we are alike. I have spent years surviving the consequences of other people's complications." He flinched, the smallest breach in his composure. You believe I have acted carelessly. I believe, she said evenly, that your gestures carry weight you are accustomed to bearing, and I am not. Silence returned, thicker now. The firelight threw their shadows against the walls, stretching them into unfamiliar shapes. At last he spoke, his voice quieter. There are rules I do not break. I learned them early, at cost. They have preserved what remains of my family and my name. And yet you break them, Eleanor said, her tone neither accusing nor hopeful. First the gloves, then the arm, then this. He exhaled, a sound of frustration edged with something like regret. I broke nothing, he insisted. I acknowledged what was already seen. That is a comfort afforded to men, she replied. Women are seen whether we consent or not. Her words struck home. He turned fully toward her, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in him. You think I wish to endanger you, he said. I think you wish to ignore me, Eleanor answered softly, and found you could not. The truth of it settled between them, undeniable. He crossed the room then, stopping a careful distance away. You are wrong, he said. I noticed you because you did not ask to be noticed. A laugh escaped her, brittle and brief. That has never protected me. No, he agreed. It protected me. Until now. She studied him, this man so accustomed to command, now stripped to restraint and confession. Why summon me, she asked. If not to apologize, or to explain, then to what end? He hesitated, and in that hesitation lay the turning of the night. Because I needed to know whether you would look at me with gratitude, he said, or with contempt. And which do you see? Eleanor asked. Neither, he replied. I see resolve, and I find I admire it more than is prudent. Her breath caught despite herself. Admiration is not protection. No, he said. It is risk. The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then insistent. Eleanor felt the moment slipping toward something irrevocable. If you intend to rescue me, she said, do not. I will not be carried into safety like contraband. His expression tightened. And if I intend nothing of the sort? Then speak plainly, she said. I will not endure half measures. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, very quietly, he said, I intend to keep my rule, and I intend to see you again. The contradiction hung sharp and dangerous. Eleanor stepped back, understanding dawning. Those intentions cannot coexist. I know, he said. She inclined her head, a gesture of farewell heavy with restraint. Then you have your answer. As she turned toward the door, the key glinted in the firelight, still in the lock. Behind her, his voice followed, stripped of title and certainty. Miss Hartwell, he said, if I asked you to stay. She paused, her hand hovering inches from freedom, aware that whatever came next would alter the shape of her life. The fire roared suddenly, as if in warning, and she waited, heart poised between dignity and disaster. The silence stretched, heavy with things unsaid, while rain traced slow paths down the windows. In that charged stillness, Eleanor understood walking away would not end the matter. Behind her, the Duke did not move, yet his presence pressed close, a force restrained by will alone. Rules had shaped him, just as scarcity had shaped her, now collided in the narrow space between breath and choice. She did not turn, but she felt the weight of his gaze, steady as judgment. Outside, thunder murmured distantly, a promise or a threat she could not yet name. When she finally lowered her hand, leaving the door unopened, the night seemed to lean closer, expectant. The following evening unfolded beneath a sky the color of bruised steel, as carriages arrived in solemn procession before Lady Ashcombe's townhouse. Lanterns glowed against the damp, reflecting in the polished doors like wary eyes. Eleanor stepped down alone, her cloak drawn close, her spine straight with the resolve of someone entering judgment rather than celebration. Inside, the rooms gleamed with refinement, yet beneath the civility pulsed anticipation, sharp and hungry. She felt it immediately, the collective awareness that tonight demanded resolution. Whispers trailed her progress, softer than before, but more deliberate. She was no longer merely pitied. She was awaited. Every step echoed like a question no one wished to answer aloud, yet all pretended ignorance tonight there. The gathering tightened as music stilled, conversation bending toward a single point. The Duke of Ravensmere stood near the mantel, immaculate and remote, his presence commanding without effort. Eleanor felt his attention before she saw it, a steady weight that neither flattered nor dismissed. When his gaze met hers, the room seemed to contract. He crossed the space between them with measured steps, each one a challenge issued to decorum itself. Murmurs rose, fragile as glass. Lady Ashcombe stiffened. Eleanor remained still, refusing to retreat. Every unspoken rule pressed inward, awaiting his decision with merciless patience and breathless attention. He stopped before her, close enough to alter destiny without touching, without apology, without retreat or explanation for the watching crowd. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice low but unmistakably clear, "you appear unsettled." Eleanor inclined her head, meeting the scrutiny without surrender. "I'm accustomed to it, Your Grace." The title sounded heavier than iron. He offered his arm, the gesture unadorned yet irrevocable. The silence that followed rang louder than applause. Eleanor hesitated, knowing acceptance would bind her to rumor, refusal to disgrace. She chose neither impulse, but principle, and placed her hand upon his sleeve with calm precision. A collective breath was drawn, then held, as though the room feared movement. In that instant, her fate tilted, balanced on his restraint, and the crowd learned stillness could wound more deeply than any spoken insult ever could hear tonight. They stood thus for a moment that altered reputations. Then he spoke again, not loudly, but with a finality that carried. "You will remain," he said, "until the evening concludes." It was command shaped as courtesy. Eleanor felt the trap within the velvet. "I'm not yours to direct," she replied softly. A flicker crossed his face, surprise sharpened into respect. Around them, society strained to interpret the exchange, sensing battle where only politeness appeared. Eyes glittered with calculation, hopes, and the thrill of impending disgrace. Eleanor sensed the cost rising, paid always in a woman's name. The Duke's posture never wavered, though something restless stirred beneath. Rules tightened around him, even as he tested them in silence now alone. As the evening wore on, the performance continued, a dance of appearances sustained by will alone. Eleanor endured it with measured grace, though her nerves hummed. She felt Ravensmore's attention return and withdraw, like the tide testing shore. When at last he spoke again, it was with restraint strained thin. "Walk with me," he murmured, not as request but necessity. She nodded once, understanding that refusal would only postpone the reckoning. They moved through a passage heavy with listening walls and veiled judgment. At the threshold, he stopped, voice lowered to iron control. "Leave now," he said, "or accept what follows." The choice landed between them, heavy with consequence. Eleanor's breath caught. Dignity braced against instinct and memory flared bright. "I will not be threatened into safety," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "Nor flattered into dependence." The Duke's jaw tightened. "This is not a threat," he replied. "It is the boundary of what I can offer." She studied him, seeing the strain etched deep. "Then your offer is insufficient." The words cost her, but she did not retract them. Around them, the house seemed to lean inward, waiting. For a heartbeat, pride and fear warred openly in his gaze. "Very well," he said at last, voice quiet with resolve. "If you leave," he continued, "London will decide for you." "I would rather face that," Eleanor answered, "than lose myself." Her conviction rang like struck glass alone. She turned then, choosing the open door and the waiting judgment beyond. Each step reclaimed a fragment of herself, though sorrow shadowed the victory. Behind her, silence fell, abrupt and terrible. She expected no pursuit. Men like him did not chase, they endured. Her fingers brushed the handle. Freedom lay inches away, cold and uncertain, yet wholly her own. The choice has been made, she thought, heart steadying. "Eleanor," he said behind her, breaking the rule at last. She stopped, shock rippling through resolve like heat through glass. The room seemed to exhale as his restraint fractured. "I have misjudged the cost," he said, voice stripped bare. "Do not go," he added, "until you hear everything. I owe you truth." Eleanor did not turn, but the words reached her as surely as hands might have. Truth was a dangerous offering, one she had been denied too often to refuse lightly. She closed her eyes, breathing once, twice, anchoring herself against hope. Behind her stood a man unmade by his own rules, before her a world sharpened by judgment. Slowly, deliberately, she withdrew her hand from the door. The silence thickened, heavy with the knowledge that what followed would ruin one of them, perhaps both. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, resolute, and unforgiving. "Speak, then," she said. "But know this, your grace. Once heard, truth cannot be returned to silence." In the hush that followed, the Duke stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing to something perilous and intimate. Outside, the house held its breath. Inside, a rule stood trembling on the brink of collapse, and love, unnamed and unwelcome, waited for its sentence at the edge of destiny. He did not speak at once. When he did, it was without title or armor, the Duke of Ravensmere reduced to a man standing at the edge of his own making. "I have lived by one rule above all others," he said quietly. "Never bind another life to mine. I learned early that my name carries ruin as easily as protection." He paused, then added, "My mother married for duty, my father for pride." What followed was silence, bitterness, and a house that learned how to echo. Eleanor turned at last, slowly, meeting his gaze. In the lamplight, his composure was frayed, his certainty eroded by confession. "I vowed never to repeat it," he continued. "Never to offer half a life, or demand endurance dressed as devotion." "And yet you summoned me," Eleanor said. "Yes," he answered simply, "because you unsettled the rule." The truth of it struck with more force than any declaration of affection could have. He was not pleading. He was admitting fracture. Eleanor folded her hands before her, grounding herself in habit. "You have already endangered me," she said. "Your attention has made me spectacle. Your silence would have ruined me. What remains that truth could possibly mend?" He stepped closer, careful, as though approaching a skittish creature. "Choice," he said. "I would give you that, fully, without disguise." His voice steadied. "If you leave tonight, I will not follow. I will ensure the rumors fade, though you will bear their shadow. If you remain—" He stopped, breath shallow. "Then I must break the rule entirely." Her heart thudded, loud as thunder. "And what does that entail?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Marriage." The word fell into the space between them, heavy and irrevocable. Eleanor felt its weight settle into her bones. Marriage was safety, yes, but also surrender, exposure, permanence. She searched his face for calculation, for pride masquerading as sacrifice, but found neither. Only resolve edged with fear. "You would marry to silence gossip?" she asked. "No," he said. "I would marry because I will not have you diminished by my hesitation, nor will I offer you refuge without name." His voice lowered. "And because I find I cannot return to a life in which you do not stand before me, unafraid to speak." The room seemed to tilt. Eleanor's thoughts raced, measuring survival against selfhood. She had learned to endure alone, to build dignity from scraps. To bind herself to a man so powerful was to risk everything she had preserved. Yet she saw now that refusing him would not restore the past. It would only condemn them both to quieter forms of regret. "You offer much," she said slowly. "But understand this. I will not be managed, nor hidden, nor made ornamental." His answer was immediate. "Nor would I survive you as anything less than equal." The sincerity in his tone unraveled something she had armored long ago. She drew a breath, steadying herself. "Then know this," she said. "If I accept, I do so not as refuge, but as choice. And I will walk away the moment I am treated as debt rather than partner." He inclined his head, solemn. "Then we are agreed." Footsteps echoed beyond the door, a reminder that the world waited, hungry. Eleanor glanced once more toward the exit she had nearly taken, then back to the man who had bought it not with force, but with truth. "Very well," she said. "Let us end this." They returned together to the drawing room, their entrance arresting all sound. Faces turned, eyes sharpened. The Duke did not release a hand. He moved to the center of the room, Eleanor beside him, and spoke with calm authority. "I will not have Miss Hartwell's name speculated upon," he said, "nor her character questioned." A murmur rippled. He continued, voice unwavering. "She leaves this house tonight as my intended wife." Shot crashed through the assembly. Eleanor felt it like a wave breaking, but she did not falter. She stood straight, gaze level, claiming the future spoken aloud. Lady Ashcombe's fan stilled mid-motion. Whispers erupted, then died beneath the Duke's raised hand. "Any objection," he added coolly, "may be addressed to me." No one spoke. Later, when the house emptied and the night exhaled, Eleanor found herself standing beside him at the window, dawn just beginning to pale the sky. "You have changed everything," she said softly. He looked at her, a wry smile touching his mouth. "So have you." The carriage waited below, ready to carry them into consequence and promise alike. As they descended the steps together, Eleanor felt no triumph, only a steady certainty. Love, she knew now, was not rescue. It was recognition, and in choosing one another, they had not silenced the world, they had dared it to speak.